At high noon in Jerusalem, the sun did not merely fade, it was violently erased. This was not an eclipse, it was an astronomical impossibility. For 3 hours, the world became an eyeless void, as if the Creator had reached out and snuffed the stars. Then, as the Son of God drew his final breath, the very skeleton of the planet began to snap. Rocks split like dry parchment. The 60-foot veil of the temple was shredded by invisible hands, and ancient graves began to unlatch their hinges. Nature was not just reacting to a death, it was witnessing a cosmic eviction. What happened in that obsidian darkness was a divine war for the soul of humanity, and the 7 wonders of the cross were the signals that the old world was being torn to pieces. High noon in Jerusalem should have been a symphony of light. The Passover sun, at its burning zenith, usually turned the white limestone of the city into a blinding mirror and set the golden plates of the temple ablaze. The streets were choked with pilgrims, their voices a rising tide of prayer and commerce. But at the very moment when the day should have been at its brightest, the sky failed. It was not the creeping shadow of a moon, for a lunar eclipse is an astronomical impossibility during the full moon of Passover. This was a sudden, violent erasure of light. Centuries earlier, the prophet Amos had whispered of this day, warning that God would cause the sun to go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. This was the darkness of divine judgment, the very shadow of God's wrath falling upon the weight of human sin. The sun, commanded by its Creator to give life to the world, simply hid its face. It refused to witness the agony of the one who had spoken it into existence. In that terrifying, shadowless twilight, the physical world began to unravel. As the Son of God released his spirit into the hands of the Father, the planet itself began to wail. This was more than a poetic echo. It was a localized geological upheaval centered on the Dead Sea Transform fault system. To the observers on Golgotha, it felt as if the bedrock of Judea was being ground between the palm of 2 giants. Geologists today find the sediment of this era, the seismites in the En-Gedi region, disturbed and deformed, testifying to a mid-1st century tremor that disrupted the very stratigraphy of the earth. Matthew 27:51 records that the earth quaked and the rocks were split. Fissures began to snake through the rocky hillsides of Judea, like black lightning carved into the stone. Jerusalem, the city of peace, swayed as the foundation of the world trembled. This was the planet responding to the death of its architect. The dust that God had once breathed into life to create man now heaved in agony because man had returned the Creator to the dust. The earthquake signaled that the old order was being violently shaken to its roots. The age of shadows, of unceasing animal sacrifice, and of the religious systems that kept humanity at an arm's length from the divine was cracking open. Amidst this tectonic cry, the Roman soldiers stood their ground, but their iron resolve was melting. The centurion in charge of the execution looked up. This man was no poet. He was a machine of the empire, a professional of the macabre, who had spent a lifetime breathing the copper scent of blood. He knew the sounds of a man breaking, but this death had been different. Through the unnatural gloom, he had watched the man in the center not scream in fury, but whisper in grace. He had heard the King of Kings ask for the forgiveness of his own executioners, while the nails still burned in his flesh. When the tetelestai, the final tectonic cry of "It is finished," echoed across the hill, followed by the earth's violent, weeping spasm, the centurion's worldview, forged in the iron and fire of the legions, lay in ruins. As he fell to his knees in the trembling dirt, his sword clattered uselessly beside him. With a voice cracked by a terror that had turned into truth, he made the first Gentile confession of the new world. Surely this was the Son of God. He saw that the true light of the world was shining brightest at the very moment it seemed to go out. While the earth groaned and the soldier knelt, a more violent destruction was occurring within the golden walls of the temple. Behind the heavy doors of the holy place hung the veil, a gargantuan tapestry 60 feet high and 4 inches thick. It was not mere cloth. It was a wall of woven defiance, a masterpiece of blue, purple, and scarlet linen that had stood for generations as a sentinel of exclusion. For 15 centuries, this curtain whispered a singular, devastating truth. Stay back. You are unholy. God is separate. But as the great high priest breathed his last, a sound erupted from the heart of the temple that no human ear was meant to survive. It was the sound of eternity tearing. Without the touch of a single human hand, the massive veil was gripped from the top, at a height no man could reach, and ripped straight down to the bottom. This was not the frayed wearing of old fabric. It was a divine eviction. The impenetrable barrier, so strong that traditions say even teams of horses could not pull it asunder, was shredded like a spider's web by the fingers of the Almighty. In an instant, the Holy of Holies, the throne room of the presence, where only one man could enter once a year under the threat of death, was laid bare. The secret was out. The darkness was gone. The writer of Hebrews would later reveal the terrifying beauty of this moment. The curtain was his flesh. As the body of Jesus was torn on the Roman wood, the spiritual barrier between the Creator and the creature was decimated forever. The veil did not tear to let a trapped God out. It tore to let us in. As the spiritual barriers fell, the gates of the grave itself began to unlatch. The same seismic convulsion that had rattled the temple's foundations now traveled through the rocky arteries of the Judean hills. In the eerie, shimmering twilight following the final cry of the king, the heavy limestone slabs of the ancestors began to groan. Rocks that had been sealed for generations split with the sound of a shattering curse. These were the ancient resting places of the holy ones, the prophets and the faithful who had fallen asleep dreaming of a day they would never see. Now, those dreams were waking up. Matthew records a mystery that defies every law of the natural world. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They stirred in the shadows of their sepulchres, their lungs filling with the first breaths of a new creation. Following a precise divine order, they remained in the quiet of their caves, waiting for the firstborn from the dead to emerge first on the third day. Only after his resurrection would they walk the streets of Jerusalem, as living proofs that the jailbreak of the grave had begun. While the world trembled and the sky's obsidian shroud began to pull back, a different kind of miracle took root in the shivering hearts of men. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus emerged from the shadows of the Sanhedrin. Fear was replaced by a courage that defied the halls of power. Joseph stepped into the light of the Roman praetorium to demand the broken body of a condemned king. Beside him stood Nicodemus, no longer the man who came by night, but a man who now brought a king's ransom, 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, and staggering, extravagant weight of spice reserved for the burial of monarchs. The air in that cold, rock-hewn chamber grew thick with the scent of sacrifice. They wrapped the silent word in clean linen and laid him in a tomb where no man had ever slept, a virgin cave carved from the mountain's heart. They prepared for a funeral, but they were actually preparing for a coronation. While the sweat of Nicodemus and Joseph still hung in the damp air, a different kind of labor was beginning outside. The religious elite found no peace in the silence of the Sabbath. They remembered a haunting promise whispered by the Nazarene. "On the third day, I will rise." Under the cover of Saturday's shadows, they hurried to Pilate, pleading for defense against a dead man. Pilate's response was a chilling coldness. "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." A detachment of Rome's elite soldiers, iron-willed men trained to hold empires, marched to the garden. They pressed the official imperial seal into the wax against the rock. This was the signature of Caesar, a warning that to move this stone was to declare war on the throne of the world. They attempted to imprison the light in a cage of limestone, placing the weight of Rome against the breath of God. The Sabbath ended in a suffocating silence, but as the first sliver of gold pierced the horizon, the rhythm of the world changed. Mary and the other faithful women moved through the pre-dawn gray, their hands heavy with spices. They walked toward a dead end, whispering the impossible question, "Who will roll away the stone?" But as the garden came into view, the logic of the world shattered. The massive limestone wheel, a weight of nearly 2 tons, lay discarded in the dirt. In the realm of physics, a stone of this magnitude, seated in a sloping track, requires the coordinated leverage of several grown men to move upward against gravity. Yet it sat displaced, not to facilitate an exit, but to invite an inspection. The author of life possesses a resurrected body, one that can move through material barriers as easily as light moves through glass, making the stone's position irrelevant to his departure. Its movement was for the sake of the witnesses. The Roman seal was a broken toy. The guards were as dead men. And there, sitting upon the stone, was a being of lightning who mocked the very concept of the grave. His message was a celestial taunt against the dark. "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." The vacancy of the tomb was only the beginning. When the dawn light finally crept into that hollowed mountain, it did not reveal the chaotic wreckage of a grave robbery. There were no signs of a struggle. Instead, there was a silence so profound it spoke louder than the earthquake. White linens lay in the dimness, glowing like fallen snow. John 20 tells us that when the disciples entered, they saw the linen strips lying there, but the sudarium, the cloth that had covered his face, was folded, set aside in a place by itself. This detail is the most haunting of all. In the 1st century, the resins of burial, myrrh and aloes, would have hardened into a resinous shell, bonding the fabric to the skin. To remove the body by force would require cutting the linen or tearing the flesh. Yet the grave clothes remained like an empty chrysalis, undisturbed in their shape. The folding of the face cloth suggests a deliberate, unhurried act of mastery. Death was not escaped. It was exited with the calm precision of a man who owns the room. The silence of the tomb did not signify an ending, but a deep, cosmic breath before the exhale of a new creation. For 40 days, the horizon of Judea became the stage for a miracle that refused to stay hidden. This was a period where the boundary between the celestial and the terrestrial grew thin. He was no ghost. He was terrifyingly, beautifully physical. On the shores of Galilee, The smell of charcoal smoke mingled with the salt spray as he sat by a communal fire, breaking bread with hands that still bore the crimson craters of the nails. He ate fish with the men who had abandoned him. To touch him was to touch the future, a body that death had processed and found indigestible. He appeared to the 11, then to 500 at once, turning a ragtag assembly of frightened fugitives into a phalanx of world changers. He taught them as the living word, explaining his own heartbeat. Every scar on his flesh was a map of a war already won. The fisherman who once cowered behind locked doors now looked at the sun and saw only its servant. We have long looked at the events of Calvary through the lens of human tragedy, but we must now see the restructuring of reality. The 7 signs were the birth pangs of a new world. In those 3 hours of obsidian sky and trembling earth, the laws of the universe were being rewritten. We witnessed a collision where the entropy of our fallen world met the infinite vitality of the Creator. The darkness that blanketed Jerusalem was the shadow of God bending down to kiss the earth, a holy eclipsing of the old sun to make way for a light that would never set. When the earth heaved, it was the physical manifestation of the curse of Eden snapping. The ground, which had been cursed to swallow the bodies of the fallen, was now being commanded to yield its captives. The victim on the central cross was not being consumed by the darkness. He was consuming it. This was the moment the cross, a jagged instrument of Roman state terror, began to transform. In the spiritual architecture of the cosmos, it stretched its arms until they spanned the horizon, turning from a dead beam of timber into the tree of life. The local execution of a Galilean carpenter became the universal pivot of history. Every law of physics that dictates things must fall apart. Every biological certainty that life must end in dust was surrendered to the one who took the sting of the grave into his own veins and neutralized it with a higher life. The torn veil and the open tomb scream a single reality. The barrier is gone. The King is victor, and the dawn has broken the back of the night. That noonday midnight was not the end of the world, but the precise moment the world finally began to heal. Look upon these 7 wonders as the deliberate strokes of a divine pen. This was the final signature. When the ink of the old covenant had dried in the dust of Golgotha, God leaned down to sign the new in the language of the cosmos. Consider the rhythm of this sacred exchange. Darkness fell at noon, so that you would never again have to walk in the shadow of judgment. The sun hid so that the light of the world could shine from within the human spirit. The earth's foundation convulsed so that your life could finally rest upon a foundation that cannot be moved. Within the temple, the veil was not merely torn, it was obliterated, proving that this was not an act of man reaching up, but the hand of God reaching down. The tombs broke open, and the saints arose to remind us that death is no longer a prison, but a passage. The centurion's confession proved that no heart is too hardened for the Master's touch. The royal burial and the Roman seal were but paper walls before the fire of the resurrection. The sting of the grave has been permanently blunted. The tomb is empty, not because of a theft, but because life could no longer be contained by cold limestone and human iron. The linen cloths were folded with the calm precision of a victor who knew his work was finished. The question of the folded napkins remains the most provocative riddle of the empty tomb. Why would a man whose body was supposedly stolen leave behind an orderly room? In a culture where a folded napkin was assigned to a servant that the master was not finished and would return, the linens in the tomb remain a haunting, silent promise. The darkness is gone. The earth is still. The stone is rolled away, revealing a tomb flooded with a morning light that will never fade. The barrier is gone. The price is paid, and the invitation is written in blood and light. The veil is shredded. The king has walked out of the mountain.